Hi, I'm Father Joe Grimaldi, but you can call me Joe, and welcome to my podcast. Today I would like to share with you some thoughts on the conversion of St. Paul. We celebrate the feast on the 25th of January, and if Paul were alive today, we might consider him the original bully. Prior to meeting Jesus, he berated Christians. Then one sentence determined his theology when the Lord said to him, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Let's discuss this, but here's our host, Ken Calvert.
January 25th, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. One of your favorites, correct?
It is.
Yeah. Why is he one of your favorites, first of all?
You know, it's very hard to speak about Paul without speaking about Peter. They're the two pillars of the church. Without Paul, I don't think we would have a church that we have today. I'll tell you why. Peter was the Orthodox preacher, if you want. He was the Bishop of Rome. He didn't know he was bishop, I'm sure, at the time. But all the other bishops deferred to Peter. And that's what made him the Pope, because he was the one that when they had a question in the early days, it's not like today where you have all these committee meetings and so on. No, they had a question, they'd write it down or whatever and get it to Peter. They always deferred to Peter. However, if Peter didn't have Paul, the church would have stayed in Rome and Jerusalem and would have gone nowhere. Whereas Paul comes in, he's the ultimate preacher after his conversion, of course, and his initiation too. He goes and travels. It's mind-boggling to me when you think that you could go from Jerusalem to Syria to North Africa, and these are different countries, but by the same token, even though they're close by our standards, you don't just have a hop, skip, and a jump to get there. You have to go through a lot of maneuvering, and so on and so forth. But he did it. He founded a lot of these seed churches. I call them seed churches. And then he kept in contact with them with his epistles and his letters. The ultimate letter that Paul ever wrote is the letter to the Romans. That letter is long. It can be a little bit challenging, but it contains every aspect of our faith in the best way. It's just a marvelous situation. So what I'm saying is this. Yes, we're concentrating on Paul today, but by the same token, Paul and Peter really go together because Peter was the one who kept the church steady. They didn't go wild, if you want. He was orthodox and so on. Paul goes out and he does his ministry to the outside world. I mean, literally the outside world of where they were living.
Paul would have been how old at his conversion?
At his conversion, I'm guessing he had to be around 30.
Okay.
The first martyr of the church is St. Stephen, and that's always celebrated on the 26th of December. On the Feast of Stephen, the old hymn,
Mm-hmm.
Good King Wenceslas looked out on the Feast of Stephen when the snow lay on the ground, good and crisp and even. But anyway,
I didn't think you'd like to sing. You told me that a long time ago. You said in the shower. That was
that's
fine.
right. The shower.
You did a nice job. Thank you.
But anyway, in any case, you have Stephen is being martyred, right? In the background, in the crowds, we're told that Paul happened to be there, or Saul at the time, if you want, happened to be there, and he was thoroughly impressed. But he still didn't do anything about it because he was still a persecutor of Christ. But he was impressed with the martyr Stephen, that there was something that it's almost as if you light a candle within your heart, and all of a sudden it might grow quietly, secretly, and so on. But something there was growing within him. So the conversion, even though it's always portrayed in a very dramatic way, it does have the element of something that has matured through time.
Was St. Paul in Syria at the time of his conversion?
He was going from Jerusalem to Damascus, to Syria. So he was on his way when all of a sudden something happened. What that is, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, frankly. But something happened. The way it's always portrayed. Now, see, if you were to go to Rome, you know that many of the most beautiful works of art are in churches. And they're protected now by the state, but by the same token, and they're worth millions and millions of dollars. But there's, and I'm sure you know the name, is Caravaggio is a famous artist, and he did the portrayal of Paul being knocked off the horse, and so it's very beautiful. It's very dramatic. I mean, the horse is almost upside down, and Paul is on the ground, and so on and so forth. But that's the way people portray it, because to say that he was knocked down, what does that mean? You have to interpret it by saying maybe it means all of a sudden Paul was humbled. You know how we get we use different phrases for different reasons, but he saw the light. It was such a light that it blinded him for 3 days. That's when he was guided in Damascus. He went to see one of the leaders of the government there. His name was Ananias. And Ananias tries to explain to him about Jesus and so on and so forth, because Paul was bringing it up. He's blinded. Something happened to me. I was walking and I was running, I was riding, whatever it was, and something happened. I was humbled, and this light now has blinded me completely. So Ananias works with him and makes him able to see. Now, we're told that Paul did not automatically convert. He started to think about what happened. Maybe it was the equivalent of what we call the RCIA today. I don't know. But he was guided by some of the disciples of Jesus, and it took him like a 3-year period. He was in Arabia. He was in solitude, thinking about things, and it's only after he was guided by the disciples and where he became a wealth of knowledge of what this was all about. There are 2 very, very important aspects of how and why he was knocked off, why he was humbled.
I mean, it's almost a metaphor.
It is.
You get knocked off your high horse.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that struck him most was the fact that forgiveness is a gift. By the way, that's another topic we should talk about at some point, forgiveness. But anyway, so forgiveness.
I'm writing them all down.
Forgiveness is a gift. Paul, before that, he was persecuting. He had no right to receive forgiveness. He had no right to receive salvation. But the Lord gave him salvation despite the fact he did what he did. The human race did not have a right to receive salvation. Salvation is free. That's one of the main tenets of Paul's discussions in his writings, is that salvation is free. And it's, basically Martin Luther took off on that, if you remember what he did. He saw that Paul speaks about salvation is free, it's a gift, and so on. And then Martin Luther says, all you need is faith. Well, yes and no. We do need faith, and it is a gift, but we need to do a little bit more. We have to respond to God's love. He doesn't want us to work for it. We can't work for salvation. We can't earn salvation. But by the same token, we have to respond to God's love. And this is what it means to be embraced by God, if you want. It's not that we're working for the salvation. The salvation is there. It's for the taking. It's free. But by the same token, I think we have to respond to love. If someone loves us, we respond to love. So salvation was free. The other thing that struck Paul, if you look at the way Jesus asked the question, why are you persecuting me? He was persecuting everybody, not just me. Look at it this way. The church and Jesus are one. Paul was persecuting the church, me, which is Christ. But the other thing, too, there was a tremendous realization for Paul. When you speak about what is the conversion, well, the conversion is that he finally saw that God and Jesus are the same. They're one. So, in a way, you have three aspects, okay? You have salvation as a free gift that we cannot earn. It's given to us out of love. The next thing, I think, is that Christ and God are one and the same. And the other thing, too, when you go a little bit further, that Christ and the church, we're the body of Christ. The church is the body of Christ. So if you're persecuting me, you're persecuting us. You're persecuting the whole body of Christ. The wealth of knowledge that you get from reading Paul is, to me, mind-boggling. I can't even come close, but I'm fascinated by it because he was such a wonderful individual. And when you consider the number of things that he did in his lifetime, imagine establishing these churches and then being able to communicate with them by letter, if you want. So you have the letter to the Ephesians. That's one of the nicest letters because in it you get the idea that only now are we beginning to realize that there's no difference between man, woman, black, white, Christian, Jew, whatever. And Paul puts that down specifically. We are human beings created in the image of God. And so this comes across, I think, in the letter to the Ephesians. The letter to the Romans is the most theological of the letters because it gives us the theology of the church.
It's my understanding from what I've read that St. Paul was a gifted writer.
He was a gifted writer, and you go a little step further because there are many of the, not many, but a number of the letters of the epistles were not necessarily written by Paul, but to give them a sense of importance they did in those days. They're pragmatic. They're very practical. They said they were written by Paul.
So you're saying even St. Paul had a speechwriter?
Well, no. That's not what I'm saying. But
a scripture
other
writer?
People borrowed his name. Let me put it that way.
Oh, is that right?
To legitimize what they had written. The other thing, too, as I mentioned, I think the theological points that he brings out in the Romans is, again, Paul realizing for the first time that God and Christ are the same. And the other thing, too, is that the church is the body of Christ. And therefore, persecuting Christ was persecuting. And this is where it prompts Jesus to ask the question, why are you persecuting me? But it's the body of Christ. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe Podcast.